Here we go. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and hello to co-host Peter Bale. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is The Hoon. Peter, how's it going?
Bernard, you're looking very good. You're looking very stylish. You look as though you've been for a swim and had a shower, which doesn't usually happen on the same day, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I've got the whole sort of frosty salt out of my hair. It's another gorgeous day in paradise here. I wonder if it'll ever rain again. And to be honest, I'm with that. That's
Well, it's Auckland, so we know that it will. Although there is, as we know, that sort of weird macro climate in Waiheke, which it's often much sunnier and warmer on Waiheke than it is in Auckland, because we get we get the orthographic rain, as I'll call it, off the city and the skyscrapers and such as they are, and the centre of town. Not to mention the Waitakeris.
That's good, and I'm loving this macro climate pumped into property values. This is
Well, we're going to talk about that with Craig Rennie later on, right? About what's going on in the property market. And as I said, Alex Spence, who's at the Herald, posted a thing on Twitter today, or an X, which was an extract of your column today, talking about, dear young people, just move to Australia. Just leave it to us boomers to run and ruin your country. Is that right?
I mean, I don't want to come across all nihilistic, but I certainly want to tell people, hey, this isn't going to solve itself. And if you think that we just need to wait for the young people to take over and it'll be fine, it's not. And I'll go into that in more depth. Yeah, we have quite a cracking show this week. We've got David Farrier on shortly.
He'll come on in a minute.
Yep. Talk to us about his plans for investigative journalism. Then we'll have Catherine Dyer, our climate correspondent, talking about the big news in forestry this week. It really is. Robert Patman about all the drama around the world of geopolitics, and there's plenty there. I'll talk with Craig Rennie as well. We'll talk with Craig Rennie about fiscal and monetary policy, how a government's budget actually isn't like a household's budget, and that we might have a rate cut next week. And also we'll find out some more about some child poverty stats that came out today. It's been an amazing week, really, Peter, with plenty of drama. The departure of Grant Robertson, although that wasn't too much of a surprise, and the shocking passing of Efeso Collins.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us to the media really a bit, and that when we should probably bring in David now, because one of the reasons I don't want to turn this into a media show, but I've been reading a lot about media, writing about it to some extent. And David, have you got a speaker on there?
I should do. Oh, wait a second. No, I'm sorry about this.
It's all right. That's all right. And I mean, one of the issues is I was really struck. I'm struck by the growth of the right wing press. I heard a very good podcast this week with our friend Duncan Grieve talking to Philip Crump, the man behind Thomas Cranmer and the new ZB Plus thing, and this whole rise of the kind of right wing media in New Zealand is quite interesting. And I interviewed a couple of politicians the other day for a media thing that I'm not going to talk about so much, but they were talking about a lack of diversity in New Zealand media. And one of the reasons I wanted to get David Farrier, who many people in our audience will know, is David did something really cool this week, I thought, which is to announce a fund from David to support investigative journalism in New Zealand on important topics. So, David, welcome to the Hoon, which I told you was apparently the ridiculous name given to a collective noun of kaka. Bernard is thrilled.
I approve.
Yeah. Bernard is thrilled to have you. He's the inventor of the kaka, and I'm allegedly his co-host. But it's really great to have you here. People will know you from your movies and from television. I need to talk to you about Murray at some point. And but you know you've made a big commitment also to journalism, whether that's in your documentaries and on your Substack, and you've made some quite big kind of revelatory discoveries. But this idea, could you tell us what your new Webworm Fund is about?
Yes, it's called, in keeping with the themes of worms, it's called Big Worm Farm. And essentially, it was, born out of the idea of, I have paying subscribers and that allows me the time to write. And in the past, I've paid other writers and guest columnists to write little pieces for me now and then. But it's gone to the point where I've been sort of putting some money aside and saving it with the idea that this might happen at some point. And it's gotten to the point where I thought, hey, I know there are people out there, journalists, not just in New Zealand, but internationally, who will be sitting on some interesting stories that don't necessarily fit in a typical media outlet. They might write for other publications. I don't mind where they write for typically. But I think Webworm has a specific voice, and it's about going down weird wormholes. And I thought, why not set up this fund? People can apply for it if they're sitting on a story and they think that, up to $6,000 would help them tell that story. Then I'm saying, this is here, apply for it. And I have a couple of colleagues who are going to help me go through the applications and
Well, expect some
taking-
from Mr. Bernard Hickey and Mr. Peter Bale at any
good,
at any moment. But
No,
Dave, what
happily.
what hole are you? What hole are you?
For you on Carbon Conjures, we're gonna just-
Yeah. How what gap do you think you're trying to fill with this, David? And I'll also invite our audience who are watching us on YouTube that if they want to send me any questions through the chat, I'll refer them to David as well.
Yeah. And
What
very
gap are
happy
you
to
filling?
take any questions? I think look. That's a really good question. I think there are certain investigative. I'm looking to tell stories that haven't been told before, and I think what I found when I was reporting on Arise is that there are certain stories that I think lend themselves to being told in a format of either a blog post, something longer, or a newsletter where you can have different parts and different installations, and you don't need to have this story told that it feels really static and has to be told all in one bit. I'm looking for deep dives that can be told across, multiple newsletters and multiple installations, and someone can start their investigation on a webworm and send something out and still be working on the story later in the year. It's not like it all has to be done at one point. And I think there's a type of journalism that's a bit more lively and alive that doesn't have a set home. Certainly in New Zealand, but also, I don't know, I see Webworm, my subscribers now come from, this sort of, there'll be 30% in New Zealand, 30% in America, 30% rest of the world. So it's a super wide group of people. And I'm looking for stories that will appeal to all those people, not just specific stories locally or geographically.
Yeah. So Bernard is a big
you make-
Substacker, as you know. So he's very eager. Go ahead,
Yes,
Bernard.
no,
Sorry.
no, I'm a huge fan of David. I'm a subscriber, and I'm really thrilled to recommend David's Substack. And it is, for me, one of those Substacks places where stories build and build. And I'm really interested, David, in what you were saying about the format of blogs and Substacks as a way to layer and build and make like a snowball going down a hill to build a story. A lot of people think of investigative journalism as, one story that comes out after 9 months of investigation and bang, that's it, and nothing happens. But actually, when you look at the really big stories, the shocks, the stories that bring down presidents and force CEOs out and drive out ministers, often in the past it has been newspapers working in tandem, in competition with each other, day after day, layering on top of each other aspects to a story, checking things, going down blind alleys, coming back out, going down again, having lots of people provide tips to various places. And it becomes a bit of a team effort. And you forget that investigative journalism is often very much a team effort that is built day upon day. And I'm curious to see how Webworm and the projects that you do take that layering, that sort of sequential rolling maul, so to speak, with a New Zealand flavour on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right, and I think something that I find really inspiring about Webworm is, as you'll know from the Kaka, it's like you build up there's people that support you and are part of the community, and they do feed into things. And we know when I was reporting on Arise Church, that story wouldn't have been what it was unless it was live, and I had constant feedback from readers and people discovering the story and then getting in touch with me via Webworm with new tips and new information, and that would never have happened. And I think all my projects have been a little bit like this. My documentary Tickled started as a series of 3 blogs, and from those blogs being put out into the universe, I got so much more information that eventually turned into a film. Sort of the same with Mr. Organ. That started off as a series of articles. So all this stuff, I like these stories that are alive and moving, and yeah, you start hearing from people, whether it's the community that read Webworm or new people that find it, and I really love that idea. And I think Big Worm Farm, I want the writers that are engaging with it to sort of think of it in a similar way and to get excited by it, and be able to embed video and audio and images and all that stuff that we get to do when we have a newsletter, and I find that really exciting.
Yeah, and David, one of the big criticisms of New Zealand media at the moment, I'm wondering how you feel about this. I've got a couple of questions about how this project might work for you. Is the lack of distinction or increasing blurring between comment and fact, between reporting and opinion? How do you feel about that? What do you? I mean, you're a much younger journalist than I am, slightly different experience and background. How do you see that sitting? That
Yeah,
balance.
It's very blurred. No, it's super blurred, and I think it's what I try and do. It's blurred, but I also try and make it very clear. I think when I write, it's very clear when I'm writing something that is like purely opinion and just me being injected in. And when you read something like the Arise series, it has some of my personality and at times sort of anger in there, but it's a very different style. And usually with those bigger stories, I will have someone working with me like Hayden Donnell, or in the case of Big Worm Farm, Roosevelt Tan's come on board, and someone else will sort of keep me in check. And I plan to do that with this, is just having more of a collaborative process, not just getting lost in the wormhole myself. But yeah, it's a big blurry mess, but I think that's not a bad thing necessarily. I think as long as when you're writing those pieces that are investigative and clearly more journalistic, you can peel back the personality, and I think it's good if readers know
I mean,
what
how
to
do
expect.
I
They know with
I guess
Webworm, they know what I am, and they know what they're getting.
yeah, I guess I just would be you'll be wanting to make sure that this isn't a hit, that they aren't hit jobs, which are frequently done in New Zealand. We've seen that with that chap Cameron Slater. Various people in New Zealand.
Who, by the way, was finally not just convicted, but a judgment was made for him to pay nearly $500,000 to.
Took a while, but we got there.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to say
to Mr. Blomfield.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that because David, I used to run the CPI, the Centre for Public Integrity in Washington, which at that point incorporated the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and I know from experience how big these projects can be, how hard they are, and what investigative journalism really is. I mean, not that I've done it myself as much, but I did run an organisation that did it. I mean, how are you going to assess what is investigative and what is just a hit job or a piece of long form reporting?
I think that's what Roosevelt and Hayden and I are going to figure out as we go. I don't have all the answers there. Literally, I think we're going to get these submissions from journalists around the planet that have stories. I'm going to look for things that suit the Webworm format of taking readers in a really interesting, clear way. And I think between the three of us, and this is a very wifty-wafty answer, but I think between the three of us, we're going to start figuring out what that is. And I don't know, I think it's pretty clear what a hit job is. I think the people within Arise Church would probably argue that was a hit job, but I see that very clearly.
Well, some of our readers are also saying, Vicky Terrell is saying thank you for your work and particularly the work on Arise. Rua MD is saying love your mahi, David. And somebody is asking me, Catherine Voyles is asking me whether it's about a piece about John Campbell and North and South. I no longer read North and South because they canned my column, but I do know that there was some controversy about John. I don't know him, but my sense is that he means well. Oh yeah, I just did cancel.
We'll
So,
have a
and
story that John did refer to it later on
excellent,
in the show.
excellent.
It's
And
breaking
someone
news.
says I just cancelled my Webworm subscription, but will rejoin again when finances are in better shape. So you've got
Oh,
you've got
completely
you've got
fine.
friends here, David, in many respects. Bernard, you want to ask the last question? Forgive me.
No, it's okay. David, you've been one of the inspirations for us Substackers in terms of how much momentum and success you've had. We've just had the traditional media in New Zealand parade before a select committee in Wellington last week, begging the government to beat up on the big tech companies to pay them money, Australian style. Some people say, don't worry, the government doesn't have a problem to solve. All we need to do is let the market rule and look at all these substackers doing so well. This will solve the problem of the dying mainstream media. What do you reckon about that line? Because you're based in the United States, where, in theory, this whole trend of the atrophication, the dilution of the mainstream media has gone further than it has even here. There are all these news deserts in Australia, and well, in
There
the
are in
United
America, no,
States.
very clearly. I mean, no, I don't think newsletters are the answer. I think it's this wonderful thing that is thriving right now, and I think it's really wonderful that they're giving people a voice and giving readers a decision to choose what they pay for and what they want to support. But no, I think I also I'm not in the New York Times. None of us are. I think it's incredibly important we find ways to keep newsrooms running. I don't know how the hell we do that, because people's attention is being drawn in a million different directions, and the concept of so much suspicion around what journalism is. But I think we need to find a way to keep these places operating, because you can't beat a big team of people that are all working together on those big stories. It's hugely important. I don't know how we solve it. Newsletters definitely aren't the answer. They're one tiny little piece of this structure.
No, we know that the Hoon is the answer, David. The Hoon is the answer.
I know, purely the Hoon.
So
Absolutely. I support that.
we'll be delighted to have you on again. It's really good to see you, and thanks so much for coming in before you go out into the wilds of Venice Beach and Santa Monica.
No, big fan. As I always like to say with this newsletter, if anyone can't pay for it, I'll sign them up for free. I never want people to be under pressure, and that's the joy of this format. I love that you can do this, and this will
Right.
work. So thank you.
Rua MD will come back in again. Thank you so much, David.
And I'm looking forward to Mr. Organ 2 and Mr. Organ 3.
Oh, God, don't make those kind of jokes. It's nice to see you all.
Cheers.
See you, David. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Catherine, I was
wonderful to have you.
going to suggest that you mute Catherine, but then I heard the cicadas and the sound of someone's hooning V8, and I thought, no, that's what we need. In fact, I wondered whether Simon, our producer, might have actually injected the hooning V8 in there as a piece of background.
There was the sounds of someone digging a hole behind me. It's like, just a while ago as well. So
Yeah.
Excellent.
No,
Well, there'll be a Briggs and Stratton two-stroke motor mower startup within seconds, I'm sure. This being New Zealand. Although if they do it when the 6 o'clock news is on, they'll get what my dad used to do, which is saying, "Who the bloody hell has got was mowing their lawns during the news? It's news time." Anyway, carry on and tell us what the climate news is, or environmental news, Catherine.
Well,
please.
Actually, Peter, we were talking just a moment earlier ago about John Campbell and a North and South article I haven't read either, and there's been some controversy about John's more opinion-flavoured commentary. I mean, that's what a column is, basically, on TVNZ. But in the last week, he's come up with a cracking story, which Catherine has dug a bit into as well. Catherine, can you tell us about Earnslaw, what's happening in Tolaga Bay, and why it's important for not just the climate, but our forestry industry?
yeah, so there was a big story that came out this week that actually John Campbell covered on One News about one of Aotearoa, New Zealand's largest forestry companies that lost its international certification under the Forestry Stewardship Council. And that was related to slash damage way back in 2018. And we know in the 6 years since that damage in 2018, there's been a whole lot more damage that's happened as a result of Cyclone Gabriel and so on. But this was specifically a response from the Forestry Stewardship Council, who sent an independent auditor down to New Zealand to audit to audit the auditors who audit the forestry companies and who give out the certifications, and they came to the conclusion that the social costs and the damage from that slash was such that that company Earnslaw shouldn't be covered under the Forestry Stewardship Council anymore.
And this Forestry Stewardship Council, it's not a brand name that we've all heard of, but in the global forestry market, this is a big stamp to make sure is on your logs, because if you don't have this stamp, everyone says, well, you're probably some sort of logger from Indonesia who's
chopping down the teak.
on the way
Yeah.
through.
That's right. Just about every country in the world requires FSC certification before they will import logs from anywhere, including places like China. So, there's not much of a market for your logs if you don't have FSC certification.
And one of the things I find interesting about this is a non-government body globally has had more impact than the government or the regional council or our law in actually, really grabbing people's attention and making stuff happen in a way that's
Exactly.
sort of encouraging.
Yeah, so it's actually quite rare for that kind of thing to happen under the FSC. And in fact, I kind of wondered, well, just how rare is it? And did a little bit of digging around into the background of the FSC and found, there's quite a bit of controversy there in their operations. So they started out really well with a lot of fanfare and a lot of support for some of the things that they were going to do, which initially the idea of it was that they would set standards for the environment, covering conservation and restoration of trees and Indigenous rights and economic and social wellbeing of workers, amongst a whole lot of other criteria. And so they basically promised a better way of doing business in the industry and that they would have an impact on deforestation. So after 25 years in the business, there was an article written in Yale 360 in 2018, and that Yale Environment 360 is a paper that's put out by at Yale University, and they basically said that it was a failed body, FSC, that they should call it a day after 25 years, that it hasn't worked as planned. It has done nothing to contribute to halting deforestation. All its label really does is increase the price and the income for the people who are under it. And that, moreover, had been a series of scandals in which FSC labelling had at times served merely to greenwash or launder trafficking in illegal timber. So basically, there was also a study out last year, an academic study that looked at an Indigenous group in Chile and the effects of FSC certification on them and their livelihood rights and so on, and that was pretty dire as well. So essentially you're talking about an organisation that has some holes that are big enough to drive illegal logging trucks through.
Good line.
And yet apparently, and the head of the FSC has said in response to critique and to questions that, there will always be people who aren't happy with what they're able to do, but that it's the best that can be done. And and in some places you can understand that might well be the case in developing countries who don't have good environmental regulatory systems and all that sort of thing. But for it to be the best that can be done in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is saying a lot about the standard of environmental regulation here, basically.
Catherine, just one more story before you go. Some research into how people would like action on climate change and how it's actually a lot more than is perceived. It sort of ties into what we've been talking about with the media earlier on. What did this study find?
Yeah, so this was a big study that was covered by Carbon Brief, and it was published in Nature Climate Change. It was a global study where they talked to 130,000 people in 125 countries and were asking them about their attitudes to climate action. They found that something like 86% of people support pro-climate social norms, 89% would like the governments to do more to tackle warming, and in fact nearly 70% of the people they talked to said that they would be willing to contribute 1% of their income to addressing climate change. But what they also found is that most of those people systematically underestimate how much support there is for exactly what they support. So most people think that they support climate action and they'd be willing to pay for it, but they think that they're a minority, when in fact they are part of a large global majority who want those things.
It's a classic case of where you think what you think is not the same as everyone else, but actually it is the same as everyone else. And once you realize that it's the same as everyone else, then you take action. We are social animals who like to follow the crowd. And if we think the crowd is in a certain place, we'll go there. And that's one of the problems, I think, is that increasingly lobbying is becoming tied up with opinion polling, in which opinion polls are used to tell the public what the public thinks, even if that's not what it actually thinks.
I think
the
orangutans
researchers-
are social animals too, Bernard.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, the way the researchers put it, they said that people are conditional cooperators. So they're more likely to contribute to the public good if they believe that others are as well. And so therefore it's really actually harmful to climate action if people think that everybody else isn't on the same page as them when they actually are. So that communication about it is really, really important.
Catherine,
Well, it
thank
looks
you
like
so
the
much
climate
for
is
being on
fine
the
where
show.
you are.
It's brilliant where I am.
Brilliant. Sometimes fine, sometimes it's too fine, but it is.
Yeah, otherwise
lovely
fine,
It
as
is a bit
someone
dry.
once said.
Yeah, it is a
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
droughty.
Lovely to hear those cicadas. Thank you very much, Catherine. Great to have you on.
Okay, thanks
Robert,
everyone.
welcome,
Good afternoon.
welcome, Robert, to the Hoon,
Thank you.
our long-time goat of the Hoon, as they say.
Oh, greatest of all time. I thought good. You are.
That's right.
Yeah.
Lovely to see you. I'll throw it over to Peter
to see
because
you.
there's been so much happening in the geopolitics.
Well, Robert, I was just looking sideways at your book list behind you, and noticed Putin's kleptocracy is there. It's always interesting to see which you've got shuffled around there. And I was thinking today,
that's written by Karen Darwisha, who was the first
who was
person.
so brave.
Yeah, well, she was my PhD supervisor. So
Was she?
Yes, and I was her first PhD student, University of
Good Lord.
Southampton in the 80s, and a remarkably brave person. Many of us were deeply concerned. I remember ringing her just when she got the book out and sort of expressed concern in a long phone call about her safety, and she said, "Well, there's nothing to worry about, Rob, because Mr. Putin, if it was written by a Russian, he would be hunting them down. But I'm just another American imperialist, so
Yeah, well, you
won't
say
worry
that. It
about it."
depends-
But I wasn't so sanguine myself.
No,
And
I
of
think
course,
you're right.
she then developed, and this may have happened anyway, but she then unfortunately developed cancer and died, which was a tragedy.
Yeah, it's a very brave book, and I remember it because it was one of the first to identify exactly what was going on, the movements of capital through the city of London, and it named names. And
It did.
I think I guess why we're leading into this is that we know quite well about Alexei Navalny and his death this week, and he named names. I mean, I was looking today again at his video of the Putin Palace, the $1 billion Putin Palace near Sochi, and apart from its ostentation, it is this kind of weird mafia-like gift from the oligarchy and the kleptocracy that keeps Putin going, and that was perhaps what Navalny was best known for, was exposing those connections.
Yes, and also Mr. Putin's incredible desire for material goodies, and which seems to have no limits, actually. And because the Sochi Palace is just one of a number of palaces he has.
Yeah, there's a new one being
And
built. I
so
saw in the
he
Gulf
sees
of
himself
Finland.
as a bit of a czar, really.
Yeah, the one in the Gulf of Finland looks absolutely. It's a kind of Thunderbird Island.
Yeah.
We've been discussing this quite a lot, actually. Tracy Island kind of idea, but it's a sort of, it's got hidden bunkers and God knows what. And of course, there's still that super yacht held in Italy, which is one of several, it would appear. And it's interesting. Did you see? I mean, just going to the Navalny thing. One of the things that I had a question of from a rather left-wing New Zealand blogger, and it was, I considered it to be rather nihilistic. It was Kyle Bernard, who I think you know, and it was really about Navalny's background, having gone to the Russia to the right wing, been at ethno-nationalist meetings, called immigrants, I think, cavities. I mean, there's a dark side to his history that we need to understand, as well as this courage and bravery. Do you think, or is that unreasonable to even think about at these times?
I think he underwent a personal evolution politically. Navalny, when he was incarcerated in Russia after returning to Russia, he described the Ukraine war as a stupid war based on lies. I'm not sure Navalny would have said that in 2014. I think he did evolve, as people do with their political views. And I think it's a bit harsh to go back to 2008 when he made some of these quite nationalistic statements. In fact, he gave sort of tacit approval for the annexation of Crimea, but subsequently reversed himself. So I think it's fairer to judge him in his anti-corruption mode. And also, he was a courageous man, and that's probably underestimating it.
Yeah,
but I think he was fatalistic as well. I think he absolutely understood the risks of going back to Russia. He feared marginalisation, though, in Germany, or death.
You mean that he would just be in exile? That he would just be
yes, there was that possibility, and I think he was quite passionate about really putting some pressure on Putin, and I think he felt that prospect would diminish by staying in Germany. He also said something very telling. I think I mentioned this before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. He told a German journalist that if Putin wants to get me, he'll get me in Germany. So he made the point, and of course we've just heard last week a former member of the Russian military who defected has been killed in Spain. So Putin has quite considerable reach.
Yes.
But the thing that really struck me was he gave an interview shortly before. He set up an organisation which was, I think, designed to withstand his death. And Yulia, although obviously shocked, and his wife shocked by Navalny's death, acted, I think, in a reasonably organised fashion. That is to say, she almost immediately said, "I'm stepping into the breach."
And to go to the Moscow Security Conference rather than be with her children at that Munich Security. Sorry, the Munich Security Conference about.
I was going to say the Moscow Insecurity Conference might be on.
Yes, excuse me, I do the jokes here. Right. Thank you very much.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, I mean that her courage was extraordinary. I mean,
the windows. Yep.
So where does the sleep? I was also, I wrote something about this today.
Yeah, I saw it. Very good.
Nemtsov shot in the back by alleged Chechens right in front of the Kremlin.
Yes.
That
was a terrible tragedy. Nemtsov was politically more gifted than Navalny and had a very clear program.
Yeah.
And that was a classic Putin killing, because 54 of the 56 security video cameras around the Kremlin happened to be switched off when the assassination occurred.
Yeah.
And least said about that, the better. But no,
and you've got Anna
he was preparing a report on Ukraine.
Yeah, and Anna Politkovskaya killed on Putin's birthday. It would appear as a present.
Was a tragedy. A very courageous journalist who did marvelous work on Chechnya, I should say. But the question that's intriguing me, on the face of it, Putin has just cleared another obstacle from his political path, from his point of view. But I'm wondering if, in fact, given the context of the Ukraine conflict, with the emotions it's unleashing in Russia, whether in fact it may be a miscalculation on his part.
Yeah, it's very. Mark Galliotti, who I'm sure you know, who's a British military historian who appears on podcasts, in fact his own even more than you appear on ours, reckons that this is the action of a banana republic, and that while Putin may be clearing the way for his election and the elections next month, it actually shows his weakness rather than his strength. So I'm not convinced of that myself.
That's exactly the point that Navalny made in a much-quoted interview he gave. He said, "Should I die, it means that Putin's weak." And that's the reason why we must fight on. He said, if I'm killed, that's the signal. A, he's weak, and B, we must have the organisation in place to continue the fight. And that's what seems to be happening.
And what did you make of the promotion of the deputy head of the Russian prison service to Major General in the same week that that Navalny? Did you think that was a coincidence?
Reward, I would say. Look, I think the West has constantly underestimated Putin's ruthlessness, and he's rewarding people. Someone was given the order, I think, to deal with Navalny, and it occurred under that guy's watch. And I think the person who's being decorated, and I think that is recognition. Thank you for obeying orders.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it, Rob? It doesn't, in a sense, and Elliot Higgins, who runs Bellingcat, the investigative OSINT investigative journalism outfit, pointed out that it doesn't really matter, in a sense, whether he was poisoned this time or whether he died of what one might think of natural causes. And he's in a gulag, for Christ's sake, and in minus 26 degree.
There was a slightly humorous explanation from the Kremlin that he was out for a walk. Out for a walk. When he appears on video cameras, he is handcuffed. You can just see him strolling off for a walk around the prison yard in minus 27 degrees.
Probably
in
with no clothes on
open air solitary
maybe
confinement much of the day.
Yeah.
This is a very cruel regime.
And the video of him from the very previous day made him look particularly healthy. I wonder, Robert, though, given what's happened with Navalny, the Russians are having a good time in the war in Ukraine, though, with a lack of ammunition for Ukraine's artillery. They've had to evacuate this big city. How do you think that changes the equation?
I think you're referring to
Avdiivka. Yeah.
Avdiivka. That was, I think, a settlement of about 30,000 people before the war. Has very little strategic value. The Russians, according to, I think, pretty sensible strategic analysts, probably expended 30,000 lives getting it, and has made the Russian army quite upset because that's terrible losses, and they don't stop. I'm not sure Russia's having a good time in the war. It certainly has a symbolic gain. It's paying a terrible price in doing so. And note that in the last 7 days, the Ukrainians have shot down aircraft worth a combined value of 350 million. That's 7 different aircraft. Also, they sunk a ship that we referred to recently.
Yeah.
And relentless targeting of Russian infrastructure. So, yes, there's no doubt about it. The decline of American support because of its domestic situation is hurting Ukraine, but there are signs others are stepping into the breach. We discussed last week that Denmark has made its entire military stockpile available to Ukraine, and I think there's a growing recognition, actually, amongst the Europeans that they can't count on the Americans going forward because there's a possibility that Mr. Trump may win the election.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Or even if Nikki Haley wins the election, that if she gets the nomination, that might make things a little bit more optimistic. But I think with the Germans about to make a decision on the Taurus, apparently, with long-range missile, and also Mr. Biden saying he still has scope, despite the lack of congressional funding, to make decisions about things like I always forget the acronym. Is it ATACMS? You'll know this, Peter. ATACMS. Yeah. There's a long-range version, 300 kilometers. There's hints coming out of Washington they're finally going to move on that. So it's all a bit iffy, but I think actually it's not good going for this war. We always forget Russia likes to project itself as a superpower. It's not a superpower. It hasn't got an economy like China's or the US. It's got a relatively small economy, about 10th in the world, and it's fighting a very expensive war. Where it's gained the upper hand recently is because it's on a war economy footing. About 30% of its GDP is going on the war, but that's causing real social tensions in Russia. And so I think that I still stick by my view that although it's not going swimmingly for the Ukrainians, it's not turned out to be a particularly successful venture
No.
for Mr. Putin.
And Robert, last week we talked a little bit about those remarkable comments that Trump made about, willing the Russians to go and attack people if they didn't contribute enough to NATO. And of course, you will have read the extraordinary remarks that Trump made about Navalny's death, turning it entirely into it's all about him. It's always about him. That it showed that what a banana republic the US was. He was sort of putting himself in Navalny's shoes as a truth teller.
Yeah, he's narcissistic to a T, I suppose. But as Mary Trump, his niece, has confirmed in a book, he's probably a very seriously ill person, and he's incapable of seeing the world other than through his own personal lens.
So, Robert, 2 years on, today is the second anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I always think that it was expected. The Americans did that brilliant intelligence leaking the weeks run up to it. That was a great tactic. The Ukrainians managed, for various reasons, to thwart the initial phase, which now Putin, of course, describes to Tucker Carlson as a tactical withdrawal. Where do you think we stand? Is it stalemate?
It's certainly. Yeah, I suppose you could describe it as a form of stalemate, but I think the Ukrainians have changed tactics. I think they tried to have a counteroffensive it was a hellishly difficult task to push back a front of 1,000 kilometers wide, which was involving entrenched defensive Russian positions. I think they've now switched. We've seen a change in command that we spoke about last week, and I think they're going for asymmetrical warfare, where they're going to target particular infrastructure in Russia, and they're hitting Russia in the rear now. And I think one of the devastating consequences that Biden may have hinted about now for Navalny's death may be to do with Ukraine. So I think one of the international implications of Navalny's death may be to stiffen European resolve. It's come home just what sort of regime Putin is. And it's put those who've been defending him in an even more difficult position.
Oh, but Robert, all leaders kill people. All leaders kill people.
Yeah, that's that well-honed journalist, Tucker Carlson, who says every leader has to kill. Well, maybe in a society where 340 million arms are in private hands, he may think that. But as far as I know, no New Zealand leader's been assassinating people that irritate.
Well, I think let's not get into Jacinda in this one yet. I've been talking to Chantal Baker. Bernard, you have a...
Yes, just finally, Robert, one of the slightly weird and slightly unnerving stories to develop this week is talk out of the United States that they think Russia is putting nuclear weapons into space. What did you make of that?
Yes, and the story surfaced, first of all, from a committee in Congress, and it has been confirmed by the administration. But it was interesting because the story was first leaked via Congress from someone who's got responsibility for overseeing intelligence. It's very difficult to make of it. I think Mr. Putin is at war with the West, and he'll be trying to develop weapons as the Chinese, as far as I can see, to hit satellite communications. We've also learnt about some on the Chinese side, Volt Typhoon recently, this cyber capacity or attack system, which is apparently like a sleeper. It sits in the system for a long time. Presumably it will be used if China decides to attack Taiwan, invade Taiwan, and then they apparently, according to the theorists, then they would trigger this system to complicate communications between Taiwan and Japan and its Asian allies and the United States. So
what I really like about
there's
this,
a lot
Robert,
going on. I wouldn't coming back to Bernard's question though. Knocking out satellites using a nuclear capability, I think, is what they're envisaging, isn't it?
The good thing is your brief is now going from international affairs to space and international affairs. So you're going to be able to ask Grant Robertson for even more money to buy more books and fund your gin distillery business that sits behind you.
Robert,
what a nice fantasy!
No, I can build it. It's good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that truly universal view of the world. That's
And
lovely.
space.
Um, and space and beyond. Robert, thank you very much.
Thank
We'd
you.
like to welcome to the show again CTU economist Craig Rennie. Craig, lovely to have you on the show, and in particularly because, as a fellow monetary and fiscal policy geek, I always like to talk about monetary and fiscal policy. And this week we had the Finance Minister, Nicola Willis, before a select committee comparing the government's budget to a household budget, saying when times are tough, the best thing to do is to
Oh,
cut
God.
back.
Thank you, Mrs. Thatcher. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you think, Craig?
It's funny. It's one of those sort of myths that won't disappear. It's a bit like the Yeti. It's sort of, regardless of what you do, it's still here. The idea that a government budget is somehow like a household's budget. Actually, the opposite is true. Government should often be investing when households' budgets are tightening. It's often better for an economy where if the government acts in what we call in the trade a counter-cyclical manner. And so the government should be spending when the households, when the economy generally is struggling a little bit. Last time I checked, we were in recession. And right now, arguably, we should actually be investing in New Zealand. We have a $210 billion infrastructure gap, and that's before population is growing at the fastest rate that we've had at some point in time. We have climate change to tackle. I note in her address to the FEC, the Finance Minister talked about the best insurance policy for climate change is low debt. The best insurance policy for climate change is to act today, is to do things today. It's not to actually wait until you can borrow some money because you've had a disaster.
And it's fascinating too to see her sticking to this quite orthodox Treasury line that the most debt we should possibly handle is 30% net GDP. I spoke to the head of S&P Global's ratings division in this part of the world, Anthony Walker, yesterday, and he said, no, New Zealand is not fragile. It could actually handle another 30% of GDP of debt, $120 billion, particularly if it was going to be used to build infrastructure, to grow the economy, cope with all these extra people, and prepare for climate change. Because one of the great ironies of this line, and you hear it many times, and I've heard it from both sides of politics, we can't borrow now because we need to be able to borrow when we have the rainy day. And so, guys, the rainy day happened. it's happening as we speak. What do you think? What do you think of that? This orthodoxy, which says we shouldn't be using the Crown's balance sheet to prepare for tomorrow, just in case something bad happens, like an earthquake or a COVID breakout or another Cyclone Gabrielle.
We should always seek to spend public money as well as we can. And we should always seek to spend money to get the best value for money possible out of that expenditure. But that doesn't mean no investment. That doesn't mean actually cutting investment. As often as not, when you undertake value for money exercises, the first thing you learn is that you're not spending enough money on various things. And we have examples. I'm in Wellington. We have examples of this right around the corner here. Every street has a leak on it because we haven't been investing in water for 30 years. We had mold in hospital walls because we weren't investing in the health service for enough. We should be investing at the right time. And unfortunately for us, the right time increasingly was 15, 20 years ago.
And not
we have a
penny
big
penny
catch-up
pinching
to go.
on infrastructure all the way through. I mean, I think this is it's such a. I mean, when Bernard and I were growing up, there was an organisation, Auckland, the Citizens and Ratepayers, and you see it now with the New Zealand Taxpayers Alliance. Is this extraordinary sort of attempt to compress the use of funds to just keep things ticking over?
Yep. And I just want to pick up on one point, Bernard, that you said. I couldn't agree more, Peter. I want to pick up one thing you said. You said this is what you call the Treasury orthodox line, about 30% GDP. I actually think increasingly it's not even the Treasury's orthodox line. The Treasury's orthodox line is, yes, you should have low debt, but you should be making the essential investments necessary in order to keep the machine going. If we went back 10 years, absolutely it would have been the Treasury's line, but I think less so now. And last time I checked on the books, which was, the December accounts for the Treasury, net core current debt was 21.7% of GDP. The UK, it would be 100%. The
Yeah.
US
So this
is
fragile comment,
120%.
not to get you drawn too much into politics, Craig. Although one of the things that I love with where you're sitting, apart from your brilliant new microphone and headset, is I think that's a Trace Hodgson cartoon from presumably
is.
from the Listener or something from the 1870s when I was in covering politics, and I think that's Roger Douglas on our right. And I miss Trace Hodgson tremendously. Not to get you too much into politics, but this line of fragility and the failure of well, I don't want to be too personal about it, but the supposed failure that was being discussed around Grant Robertson, we're not actually on the fundamentals in that bad a position, are we?
No, absolutely not. I mean, certainly, our economic recovery from COVID was one of the best economic recoveries anywhere in the world. There are arguments about whether or not there was too much stimulus, not enough stimulus, but the reality is unemployment in New Zealand fell to record lows. We saw wage growth, very high levels. We saw sustained government investment. The idea that we were somehow economically fragile when those indicators would be on the other side. If unemployment was very high, if wages were very low, if the government had no ability to borrow, if no one had any confidence in the government's finances, that would make us fragile. Instead, we have very low unemployment. We have very low levels of government debt, and our debt is very valuable around the world. People will happily pay us for more.
Yeah,
of it.
Bernard
That would
and I
be a
went out
truly
for a slap-up
fragile
lunch this
economy.
week, and he was pointing up. Sorry, Bernard and I went out for our usual 2 bottles of champagne and some oysters and a crayfish. And you said, Bernard,
Yep.
you said about
listening.
New Zealand debt.
Yeah, no, actually, we don't have a debt problem. And in fact, as we were having our lunch
Yeah.
of a
Champagne.
scone and a piece and some pasta, and a glass of tap water, the Treasury was auctioning through a syndication some 30-year bonds. And this is a big deal in the world of debt markets. The New Zealand government is borrowing billions of dollars for 30 years. And if you were fragile and the bond market had lost confidence in you, A, you wouldn't be even starting the auction, but B, you get a bad price.
Yeah.
But instead, what we saw in that auction on Wednesday, and we got the results yesterday, was for that initial $2 billion worth of bonds that were offered, $19 billion worth of bids came in. So the Treasury said, right, we're going to double the amount. We'll give you $4 billion instead. And the price came in at just 1 basis point over the secondary market price. Now,
Yeah.
for the bond market geeks amongst us, that's a bloody good price, to the point where the BNZ senior rate strategist and others came out today and said, fantastic result in the bond auction. And
Yeah.
S&P Global's head of sovereign ratings in this part of the world said to me, if New Zealand's finances were fragile, there wouldn't be a AAA credit rating.
Yeah. So why is he
And
talking it down?
Why is Chris
Why
Luxon
is
talking
Chris
it down?
Luxon talking New Zealand down? That's what I want to know.
Because
Craig, what do you reckon?
this is an old a tale as time. I like to talk about this as we have a new dog, but we're trying to teach it old tricks. It's talking the economy down, and it's talking up the fear factor. Because if you have fear, then you're not worried about spending. You're not worried about investment. You're worried about saving. You're worried about, oh, best have some cutbacks. We best agree that we would just withdraw ourselves, and yes, we'd like a little tax cut because that helps us along on the way, and that's the story to sell, not the story that actually there isn't any fragility. Because if there isn't any fragility, why aren't you investing? Why can't I have the health service that I feel like I should be having? Why can't my children have the education service that I feel they should be having? Well, because we're a very fragile state. Let's not rock the boat.
Yeah.
Let's not do any expenses. Let's just manage expenditure really well and not do anything. At the same time as we're giving landlords $3 billion of a tax cut. At the same time as we're cutting $2 billion from climate change investment. And ironically, many of the problems we have in New Zealand are due to a lack of debt. So local government is bankrupt in many places. And it's because it can't borrow anymore because the local government finance settlement doesn't work. Kainga Ora can't borrow anymore to build more state housing, even though we've got 20,000+ households on the wait list. There's plenty of opportunities to borrow. There's plenty of opportunities to invest. But the fragility argument is a nice rhetorical device to stop us from doing that and to give us some fear to manage that.
And this is where there's an opportunity for those other bond market geeks in the world who are able to say publicly, bullshit. Because unlike in 1991, when Ruth Richardson came out and said the government's finances are like the households, we're almost broke, we're about to get downgraded by Standard and Poor's, we can't borrow money in international markets, which was true. She used that excuse to slash benefits. Now, to be fair to this government, it isn't slashing benefits, not in nominal terms right now. It is doing it in real terms by changing the indexation method. But it is time to call bullshit on this, because unlike in 1991, when New Zealand did have high foreign debt, which was denominated in foreign currencies for short terms with variable interest rates, which were prone to blow out whenever there was a loss of confidence or a change in the currency, New Zealand now borrows in its own currency for long periods with fixed interest rates. So the risks that we get abandoned by the world's financial
tiny.
markets are much, much lower, not to mention the fact that our net debt at 20% of GDP is less than a fifth of what it was in 1991. So I think it's worth calling bullshit on this fragile stuff.
Well, it's worse than that. But
Can you get a word in an edgewise when you're on as our guest? Unlikely. Carry on.
It's worse than that, but because if you genuinely believed in this and you genuinely believed in a social investment approach, we've had child poverty numbers today where we've had a turning point in the child poverty numbers, and you've seen on the three indicators, two statistically significant big increases in child poverty, another increase on the numbers, although there's a statistical significance question, but on all 9 of the indicators, the central estimate of the number of children living in poverty has increased. Last year, the Nobel Prize for Economics was, not last year, but the year before, was won by a man who showed that the best investment that you could make was in the first 1,000 days of a child's life.
Absolutely.
We're condemning children to child poverty. We're condemning them to a poor start in life. You should be borrowing to invest to end, or at least to help deliver the end of that child poverty, because it will pay dividends, not only for them, but for everybody else for the next 30 years. That's a true investment approach. Simply managing down your balance sheet because you're a bit worried about the level of debt, which, by the way, isn't a worry. If we applied that rule to global firms like AT&T, would have no bond issuances. We'd have no borrowing from any firm at all. We're being asked to obtain a standard that's not measured by anyone anywhere. So it's nonsense.
Particularly at a time when the world's savers, so all the baby boomers, are at an age where they're putting money into bond funds, and all these bond fund managers are going to government saying, please borrow off us.
Yep.
I see you've got all these young people and you've got a fast growing population, and you're actually reasonably saying, we want to give you the money to fix your housing and your water and all that stuff. And it's so frustrating that the government won't jump in there. Just finally, on the other side of the monetary and fiscal policy fascination, we've seen this week councils announce that they're having to do double-digit rates increases, which of course flows through into inflation numbers and is one of the reasons why we have sticky domestic inflation. And there's some suggestion, not the majority, but there are some who are saying there could be a rate hike next week. What do you reckon?
Oh, really? In New Zealand, you mean?
Yeah, ANZ has forecast 2 rate rises over the next few months because it believes that the Reserve Bank will essentially have a least regrets approach and will increase the interest rate in order to just ensure that sticky, as they put it, domestic inflation or non-tradable inflation will then fall. It's fair to say that that's a fairly contested view amongst analysts, and plenty of other analysts will tell you that that's not the case and that there's no real need for that. I think certainly where I sit, Graham Wheeler, the former bank governor, always used to talk about an interest rate change taking 18 months to have an effect. And that's the transmission time. So 18 months from now, the 2-year expectation for inflation is well below where we are now. So you would be affecting a change 18 months from now when inflation's already well on the way down. I don't personally see that need to do that. The interest rates are already hurting many, and they're certainly impacting the housing market. They're certainly impacting investments in the real economy. There's no compelling case for change that I can see from the data that's been presented. ANZ may have a different view, but that to me is I can't see that from what they've put forward.
It will be interesting to see at 2 o'clock next Wednesday, and I have an interview with the Reserve Bank governor the following day.
Excellent. Do we?
For him,
Do we?
Yes, yes, I do. And
We.
it will be good to see what he has to say. Thank you very much, Craig. Lovely to see.
Thanks,
and
Craig.
Lovely to hear you. It is. Fantastic.
It's really good. It's such an improvement. Thank you so much. You're a voice
That's
of
all right.
you're a voice of reason that we can actually hear now.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, Peter, to hear about the cutbacks on your lunch allowance.
Absolutely.
With the
Yeah.
bottles of champagne.
That's right. My household budget is not like the government's. I can't issue bonds in New Zealand dollars, unfortunately, or print money. But anyway, Peter, you've got a skateboarding.
Well,
blog
Bernard,
post.
I was going to say something to you as well, because I've been making the mistake lately of listening a little bit to Sean Plunkett. And I also even listened to Hosking yesterday because of that ludicrous remark by the woman, by the Labour woman against Mark Mitchell.
Scale.
Yeah, and I just thought that was such a lucid, intelligent conversation between you and Craig, with my odd interjection there. But it isn't about culture wars. So anyway, let me leave you with you're totally brilliant, and you're doing something nobody else is doing, really. But a friend of mine today put a note out on X, and he's a guy called Bill Gruskin, who used to be the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. Very clever chap. And it was a little tiny annotation to a story about Boeing having fired today the head of the 737 factory in Seattle, which is it's an extraordinary place to visit because there's just lines of the buggers. And as my friend Bill said, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, just imagine being that person who's responsible for crippling one of the world's great companies of the last 100 years.
Well, we can do a separate one on that because I actually have investigated that a lot. But anyway, don't let the door hit you on the way out. I thought was an absolutely subtle and brilliant and rather gruesome joke, as they all are. Anyway, thank you, Bernard, for this today. You're totally brilliant. And
we
thank you
had
to
a
the
lovely
audience.
time going around the traps, and I shall be about to jump out and jump into the sea.
Yes, it's nearly as high tide, yeah.
Yeah. Lovely to see you, Peter. A great show, and we shall see you all next week on the Hoon. Ka kite anō.
Ka kite anō. See you. Bye. Thank you.
To be uploaded, it looks good to me.